It's green. Oh, there I am. Hello. Can you put the first slide up there? I'm honored to be here. I have lived in Waco for 12 years, and some of you who've lived in Waco a long time know that when you leave, you don't always want to come back. Just be honest. But I have been filled with joy among you just in the last 24 hours. I'm so glad to be here. As a professor of church history, I'm always struggling on how to tell a true story or true stories about what happens in the church. Our books have been written by men, and they tell the stories of men and the institutions that men have built based on the ideas that men have had. And anywhere there are men, there are women. We have just been erased from the narrative. And so I'm delighted today to tell you stories of women who refused to be erased from the narrative. And as we tell the story of who we are as people of faith and where we're going in the 21st century, let's not just look at men. Some of the men are fine and they did good things, but women have been there, and they have set a legacy for us that I hope we will continue. Next slide. In order to talk about women in the church, I need to tell you the foundation upon which women have had to build. We're going to start with a brief history of patriarchy. There was a guy named Hesiod who wrote a book in which he decided that Pandora was created as a punishment to men. In essence, Prometheus tricked the god Zeus, and so Zeus decided to trick Prometheus back. He gave Prometheus Pandora as a gift, but really she was a trick. She had a desirable appearance to disguise the fact that she was wicked and would lead him into a downward spiral. Aristotle had the idea that men are better because they're warmer. Menstrual blood is undercooked semen, the semen that couldn't. And so because women are colder, they're less perfect. And anytime there's a defect in a human, a woman caused it. In fact, he argued that all embryos are male until a woman messes it up and turns the embryo into a female baby. In essence, women are always a defect and a monstrosity. And do you know that neither scientists, nor theologians, nor historians, nor religious scholars thought to question Aristotle until the 1700s? There has been a lot of shit said because of Aristotle. Plato messed with it a little bit, but not enough. According to his Timaeus, he said that all original creatures were males. The good ones, those who could regulate their minds and their bodies, became stars. But those who couldn't became women. And if they still couldn't control themselves as women, they became animals. Then Jesus enters the picture and gives us models of men and women working together as partners in ministry. Mary playing a significant role in the life of the incarnation of our God. Next slide. And then 500 years later, Augustine, I guess he meant well, but he had some sexual disorder. He was tempted a lot, and so instead of owning his own struggle with regulating his body, which Aristotle thinks all men can do, he decided that all women were the problem. It's not that he needed to watch his eyes, she needs to watch her dress. And so he came up with this theology that men are a better image of God than women. Women are inferior temptresses who must obey the rule of men in their life. Let's skip forward about about 700 years to Aquinas. He studied Augustine, and at that time, Aristotle had trended again in the church. So Aquinas did a mashup of Aristotle and of Augustine, saying that men and women are both made in the image of God and therefore perfect, but men are more perfect than women. Man would have been a better helper to Adam, but woman was needed for reproduction. And because of reproduction, women are always in heat. They're always more sensual and emotional, and they just are not capable of rational thought. Next slide. So this is the information in the air as some of the people building the institutions of our church were building those institutions. This is the information upon which they built our church. In the time of Hesiod, women were traded as property. In fact, women were the first traded commodity. We don't have private property until women are exchanged. And then by the early church, some of that is better. Women are leaders and benefactors, which means they had money. But by the time of Augustine, they become feared as sexual temptresses unless they become nuns. So if you can rid yourself of everything that makes you feminine, if you can fast yourself into anorexia and breastlessness, then you're okay. By the time of Aquinas, even nuns are suspect. Nuns and monks who could work together in double monasteries now are separated by walls. Do we know something about that? And Aquinas somehow managed to get his teachings as part of the curriculum of law, philosophy, medicine, and theology. And Aristotle's teaching on the inferiority of women became entrenched in the curriculum of every major discipline in every university in the West, from which we are still recovering. Next slide. So this bad information has led to some assumptions about women that we are still having to overcome. First, woman is less perfect than man. 2, woman possesses inferior rational capabilities. 3, woman has a defective moral sense. 4, man is the primary creative force. In the way that a carpenter shapes wood, a seaman shapes the soil of a woman's body. She contributes nothing to reproduction. And 5, woman is in need of control, meaning in need to be controlled. And so when we talk about who the ideal woman is, well, she's submissive. And early church, very quickly through the process of institutionalization, which maybe was meant to protect what Jesus taught, but that's not what it did. It systematically eliminated women and the poor and those who didn't have access to education, meaning those who didn't have access to money. It systemically marginalized them from being able to define ideas and lead in the church. And it vilified women's bodies and sexuality and marriage and motherhood. Something I've argued in the past, the same thing that makes us Protestant, which is our belief that God wants unmediated relationship with each and every one of us, is the same exact thing that should make us all anti-patriarchy. If God wants unmediated relationship with each and every one of us, then our embodiment shouldn't come in the way of who God loves or who God saves. But Protestantism has perpetuated patriarchy, and now Luther and Calvin had the opportunity to elevate marriage as a spiritual good, to elevate sexuality as a powerful proclamation of love and incarnation, and yet they have used marriage and specifically maternal destiny as a device to keep women submitted to male control. If you don't marry, you will be asked, why not? If you do not have children, you will be asked, why not? And people will assume something is wrong with you. Next slide. Patriarchy is at the root of every systemic evil. Women were the first traded commodity, the very first slaves for their bodies and their reproductive capacities. And through abusing women, men in power learned how to enslave other men. You'll notice in some Old Testament texts, they keep the women and kill the men. They learned how to keep the men too and turn them into slaves. So slavery and the class system all originated out of patriarchal dominance over women. We all suffer from the same problem. Class oppression, racism, it's all rooted in patriarchy. And all of this happened before written history, which means these ideas of patriarchal dominance had become so normal by the time that we're developing ways to write down our stories that they were everywhere and hence invisible, completely camouflaged in the culture. These ideas were built into symbols, into language, into societal structures, and even into self-identity. Rosemary Radford Ruther says one of the most difficult obstacles for women to develop feminist consciousness is to feel angry without sin. Because our very idea of who we are supposed to be makes us feel bad for wondering otherwise. Women and all oppressed people have had to emerge from this veil to see themselves as they really are, fully human, fully in the image of God, without defect or break. They have had to go through a process of recognizing their oppression, and that is difficult. Recognizing the wrong that has happened to them, the wrong that they have done. Recognizing that patriarchy is not natural, it is learned and reinforced. That we have to be allies to each other in order to overcome patriarchal oppression. Patriarchy wants us fighting each other over who suffers the most. We need to work together to overcome patriarchy. And in order to overcome, we need to name our own goals and strategies, and imagined an alternative future that's not based on hierarchy or dominance, but on love and community. The very things women are notorious for doing well. What if God's been trying to tell the world through us how things should be? Thinking women have had to defend their right to think, their right to write, their right to teach. They've had to prove themselves over and over and over at work, in the community, and even at home. And they have had to ensure their own independence through education and financial stability. And without a lot of written records by women, it means every new generation of woman has had to start over again. Hildegard couldn't read accounts of women who had come before her because they had been conveniently lost or hidden. Every generation has to start over, making lists of important and meaningful women to inspire themselves to do great things in their generation, and know that patriarchy is built on the systematic silencing of other voices. And that is why our diaries, our journals, our blogs are us raising our voice in unerasable ways. Next slide. But nevertheless, in spite of being devalued in language and thought and likeness to God, in spite of being traded as a thing, in spite of being used to advance the prosperity of others, in spite of being denied education, and then for the lucky few wealthy women who could, having to decide between education and family, in spite of having to defend her right to think, to write, to teach, in spite of having to navigate financial dependence on men, in spite of witch hunts designed to intimidate and murder independent women, in spite of all of this, nevertheless, women have faithfully answered God's call. Next slide. Typically, we see a woman sense a call within herself and fight it off mightily, because she knows what that call will cost. She knows relationships may end. She knows comfort will go away, acceptability will go away, and story after story tells women fighting themselves for years, trying not to be called. And then when they finally accept it, now they have to explore, what will this look like for me? What avenues do I have to be in ministry? And if she's lucky enough to find a place that will have her, very soon she'll have to defend the things she's doing because she didn't do it the way someone wanted her to, or she wrote in a way that could be construed as a challenge, or she flat out did challenge, and the fact that she doesn't care is problematic for some. And I was talking with Emmy Kegler just last night. It's like your give a damn has to break in order to stand all the way up, because as long as you have a give a damn, it weighs you down. Let's talk about some of these sisters. Next slide. Christina of Mark Yates sensed her call at 13 years old. Her parents were trying to arrange a marriage for her, but she didn't want to be married because she wanted to join St. Albans Abbey. They brought bishops and priests over to argue with her, and she could argue them right out the door. Her parents eventually bribed a priest and any other religious authority to try to force her to marry. Her mother even arranged for her to be raped so that she would have to marry. You know what she did? She said she needed to relieve herself. She hung by her fingertips on the side of the building by the windowsill until they stopped looking for her. She dressed herself like a man, rode off into the night, and hid in a hole in the ground with a monk for 6 years until they stopped looking for her. On Resurrection Sunday, her mother released her from the betrothal, but by then, her visions and prayer had become so notorious that it's like they put in a drive-through lane at her hole in the ground, and people wanted to have her pray for them and advise them, and she grew to love it so much she stayed there for most of the rest of her life, leading a community of followers. Next slide. Limited by the increased cloistering of nuns in the time of Aquinas, a group of women called Beguines decided that since the institutional church wasn't making room for the ministry of women, they would organize their own community. So around the turn of the 13th century, they started living together in city buildings. There were no vows to be a Beguine. You just agreed to live with simplicity, chastity, and prayer. If you decided not to be a Beguine anymore, that was fine. They did labor to earn their own money. That means they were financially independent, which means they were scary as hell. They provided for themselves and others. They studied. They prayed. They had intense ascetic practices. They offered religious education in the vernacular. That means they had an open seminary taught by women. They offered medical care. And in their theology, they didn't focus on grand theological proclamations or what to call God. They wanted to know Jesus through his suffering and his humanity. And so they sought transcendence into God, this mysticism of abandonment. And mysticism is bigger than just the Beguines. It's a way of knowing in your body. If you've been denied formal education, the only way you can know is through your own experiences in your body. And one of the ways that the voices of women and other minorities have been delegitimized is to say that that's not real knowledge. I know what I know. Don't tell me what I know. And so by having their own visions unmediated by priests and Orthodox theology, they were able to describe God in female language and symbols. Jesus as a nursing mother, reconceptualizing the divine in their own language, attempting to recenter women in redemption and salvation narratives. It's proto-feminist biblical criticism. They questioned gender norms. They questioned the way that the clergy were leaving laity out of the worship. They were self-trained, self-named, financially independent, and by the early 14th century, there was a massive effort to shut them all down. So they would sort of move around and be disguised and take on a lot of different forms. Next slide. I want to tell you about one particular Beguine named Marguerite Perrette. She believed that the church should be open to everybody. She offered her mystical theology in vernacular language, promoting a direct relationship with God. God should be accessible. She questioned the roles of men and women and of laity and the clergy and said that the primary value of Christian life should be love. Not theology, not hierarchy, not who you know or what you have, but how well do you love? She was confident in her own voice, and she didn't wait to be authorized. She authorized herself. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, argued that the soul moves beyond itself back to God. Do you hear that mysticism of abandonment? Reason gets out of the way for love, so that you and God can be in perfect relationship. She was asked to stop teaching. She wouldn't. She was jailed, condemned as a heretic, and burned at the stake. At the same time that Aquinas was made Orthodox theology for the Catholic Church. Next slide. Teresa of Avila was a Spanish Carmelite who ended up reforming Carmelite, the order. She's a leader of that order. She had an intense illness that limited her activity pretty significantly, but it also gave her a lot of time for prayer. She believed in mystical piety. Her best-known work is The Interior Castle. It came out in 1577. As she moved in prayer through rooms of a castle, it's a metaphor for moving closer to God. She finished in the 7th room where she saw the scene of the Mary and Martha text, a text that has been used to make women feel guilty for no matter what they do. And she says, active charity is good. Contemplation is good. When we do both, we are doing good. She was pressured to write because her ideas were beautiful. But then people were afraid of what might happen if people read what she wrote, and so she had to defend what she wrote. She wasn't critiquing clergy. She was writing in a habit from behind a wall. She affirmed Catholic orthodoxy. All she said is, let the people pray and let them help care for those in need. There were some manipulative power plays to discredit her work. She wanted to reform individuals, but she had to work through a system that was determined to limit her influence. And now she's revered as one of the greatest teachers in the history of Christianity. She's an example of working in the system to change the system. Next slide. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz is an example of subverting the system. She taught herself how to read and all the things she wanted to know in her grandfather's library because she believed that for women, learning was not a sin. At 8 years old, she was sent to Mexico City to live with a viceroy's wife. He brought her to court as a poet and playwright. As a child, she's writing in a royal court, if that gives you an idea of how brilliant she was. She became a nun to give herself more time to study. If you were a young woman, your choice was to have a wealthy father who would support you till you died, become a nun, or marry. Those were the only, or become a prostitute maybe, but you couldn't pick a job, right? And so she became a nun so that she could study. She critiqued male leaders as not being true to the text. She said that men and women should both think in service to the church. People were moved by her work. And she had privileges to say and do these things because of her connection to the court. But when the viceroy's wife died, she found herself vulnerable and unprotected. A bishop found an essay she had wrote and published it without telling her. She had to defend herself against charges that a woman shouldn't write about theology or have access to education, and know that she's writing during the time of the Counter-Reformation, when any book that could challenge Catholicism was to be destroyed. She was silenced. She was forced to divest of her library, but she donated the books to anyone who wanted one instead. Obedience to God through disobedience to the church. Next slide. As European nations explored the Americas, a number of nuns and other Christian women came with them, hoping that in this new world there would be new opportunities for women. And there were a number of women's orders who came to the new world. They established mission centers and schools. In some cases, they basically invented schooling and education for young women because that wasn't something that had been offered publicly before. They rejected the cloister, they rejected the habit, they learned how to teach, and then they figured out how to navigate the system. They taught women to read and write, but once they were successful, guess who shows up and takes over? Put back in the habit, put back behind the cloister wall, to pray quietly at home where women should be. Women met a need, but were not remembered for doing so because those institutions are now named for the men who came in and took over. They had to prove that they were capable of teaching in a system they invented. They were pressured to minimize mysticism because remember, mysticism is the knowing in yourself, God speaking directly to you. There's no one to check off that what you've said is okay. By the end of the 17th century, the education of girls is seen as a religious positive. If you're worried about conversion to Protestantism or Catholicism, education is a way to help people be the faith you want them to be. And by the end of the 19th century, women have done so much with their education that they are indispensable to the health and life of the church, as I would argue they have always been. Next slide. Marguerite de Youva was born in the New World. Her father was an officer. She was educated by Ursulines, another order created by and for women. She was widowed with 2 children and sewed to provide for her family. She started caring for the poor, for sick people, for prisoners. It was beautiful what she was doing. So she gains followers and helpers. They called themselves the Gray Nuns or the Drunken Sisters because her husband used to sell hooch to natives. She founded and ran the Hospital of Montreal. And then she expanded her care from just the poor to include prostitutes, and then she created an orphanage. And listen to this, they called her a traitor because she would help anyone. Pope John the 23rd sanctified her as Mother of Universal Charity in 1959. And yet, for all those years, she's been eliminated from the narrative of Christianity. She basically created the whole infrastructure of social support in Montreal. Next slide. You may have heard of Anne Hutchinson, a preacher's kid, well-educated. She invited women to come to her home after church each Sunday to discuss her husband's sermon, something that Jonathan Edwards had been encouraging the good women of Plymouth Bay to do. She was accused of claiming that grace and works were separate. She was accused of speaking directly to the Spirit and challenging religious structure. She was accused of seducing gullible women and threatening the social order. But you can read the transcript of her trial. They're not arguing about her theology. They're arguing that she traveled at night. She spoke publicly before men. They're arguing about her gender performance while they're accusing her of heresy. They finally trapped her when they got her to say that the Spirit led her to an understanding, because to them that was heretical. They also accused her of witchcraft. That's an easy one. She was banished. She went to Rhode Island where she gave birth to a deformed baby, and they laughed at her as God's judged. She was murdered by natives in 1643, and they laughed over her dead body. Next slide. Jarena Lee was born free in New Jersey. Bishop Richard Allen of the African Methodist Episcopal Church understood that she felt a call but denied her ordination in 1809. In 1811, she was widowed, left to support 2 children, and she did this through an itinerant preaching tour all over the country. Do you know that even though she repeatedly sought ordination, her ordination was not approved until the AME conference this summer? In 2017, Jarena Lee was posthumously ordained. She challenged limits on women preachers because she said, if Christ died for us all, aren't we all to proclaim it? And she was able to say, I hear what the church is telling me to do, but I hear what God is telling me to do. Next slide. In the Second Great Awakening, Arminian theology was in the air. People were feeling this direct relationship with God, this love, this heart, warm, fuzzy kind of religion. Revivals were happening, camp meetings were happening, people were singing and dancing and stepping outside of themselves in mixed assemblies. And yet within this was also the idea that now we have this maternal destiny of women, thanks to the Reformation, so the best thing a woman can do is have, raise, and love a family. Well, women were moved by the Second Great Awakening and applied themselves very deeply to their role as mothers. And they realized alcohol is dangerous for families. Slavery is dangerous for families. And so they started organizing themselves into missionary societies and temperance societies and abolitionists, and they're at the forefront of revivalism-inspired social organizations. These are family issues, right? These are the things women have been told to concern themselves with. Well, they're trying to take the alcohol away, and they're trying to shut down the brothel, and they're trying to make sure that women have adequate health care. They're trying to make sure that children have someone to tuck them in at night and food to eat. Religion has always been what's inspired women to stand up for themselves and for others, and religion has always been used to tell women to sit down and shut up. Next slide. Maria Fearing was born a slave but was educated after emancipation. She was Presbyterian and wanted so much to go to Africa to create a missionary center there. The Presbyterian Mission Society wouldn't send her, so she financed herself. She taught religious education in the local language in Congo, focusing on women and girls. She founded the Pantops Home for Girls at Luebo for orphaned and kidnapped girls, and they called her the mother from far away. Eventually, her work was so successful that the Presbyterian Mission Society funded it and took credit for it. Next slide. You may have heard of William Seymour and Charles Parham, but I don't know if you've heard of Lucy Farrow. She was Charles Parham's cook, and she introduced the two of them to each other. Charles Parham and William Seymour are well known as the founders of the Pentecostal movement. But she's the one who introduced them to each other and to glossolalia, speaking in tongues, which is the trademark signifier of someone in a charismatic faith. She led the Azusa Street Revival in 1906 through the gift of impartation, which is helping others to experience the Holy Spirit. She went on a national preaching tour, even to Liberia. And imagine this, in its origins, Pentecostalism was diverse in class, in race, in gender, in leadership. White men kneeling at the altar where a black woman stands to preach, explaining to them how to connect with the Holy Spirit. Holy moments. You don't get an Amy Semple McPherson without Lucy Farrow. Now Pentecostalism has resplintered. We have the white kind and the black kind, and there are some in between, but they aren't as diverse as they used to be. Next slide. Helen Barrett Montgomery has been labeled a domestic feminist in that she was licensed but not ordained, so she was sort of a safe woman, right? Ordained women, they've definitely taken a stand, but as long as you're not ordained yet, maybe you're just a layperson who has leadership skills. She was the first woman to translate the New Testament into English. You can still buy her translation. She was the first female president of a Protestant denomination in the United States, the Northern Baptist. And she argued that Jesus was calling us to a new way of being human that was relational. It wasn't based on domination. He was an emancipator of women, calling them to seeing themselves in new ways. And through her mission work, she helped women in the United States become aware of the conditions of women in other parts of the world. If you read her Western Women in Eastern Lands, she talks about places in India where men would rather their wives die than have a male gynecologist help them give birth. So she encouraged women, get MD degrees and go to India to help women have access to medical care. She rallied women to support liberation, to support education, and then women like Isabella Thoburn was able to start a college in India because of the inroads made by Helen Barrett Montgomery. Clara Swain was able to lead efforts for medical missions in India, medical education, a women's hospital, and a pharmacy, both of which still bear their names. Next slide. Dorothy Day, the creator of the Catholic Worker magazine, cared deeply for the poor. She didn't just want to meet their needs in this moment. She wanted to figure out, why are people poor? Why do those who work very, very hard come home with still not enough? And so she devoted herself to working for legislative changes that would get rid of systemic poverty. Some of us know if you're born in certain places in the American caste, and yes, I said that, you stay. Barring a miracle, you stay. And she said that's not right. So she provided services for caring families. She offered care for the poor and homeless, combined with activism. And now all over the country, there are hospitality houses named for her. I wish she was already a saint. She is under consideration, but she's not a virgin, and so she's suspect. Next slide. Ida B. Wells Barnett was born a slave, and after her parents died, she had to raise the rest of her siblings. She studied at Rusk College for a while and then became a teacher and an editor. While riding on a railroad car, she was denied access to a first-class car, even though she was able to buy the ticket. She sued the railroad, and she won. She was strengthened by her Sunday school class and grew in popularity as a reporter. But she got her big break when she wrote about the lynching of black men. 8 people were lynched in 1892, 3 she knew personally. She said there's a double standard because when white men rape black women, nothing happens to them except an attaboy. When black men are even accused of looking at a white woman, he will be lynched, and that isn't justice. As a young woman, she's writing this on a national stage. She says the evidence doesn't match these charges. She publicly criticized Frances Willard of the Temperance Society for not letting partnership with black women be part of what white feminists were doing at the turn of the 19th century. There were so many attempts to discredit her work, and after she married and had children, she had a more limited career from her home. W.E.B. Du Bois credits Ida B. Wells Barnett as wakening Southern consciousness about race. Next slide. Nannie Helen Burroughs is co-founder and leader of the Women's Auxiliary of the National Baptist Convention, Incorporated. She founded the Training School for Women and Girls in 1909, and she co-founded the National Association for Wage Earners. In 1934, she created a quarterly called The Worker. As a Baptist church lady, she was an activist for wage equality, women's education, and against sexism in black churches, which was very controversial. She rallied middle-class social club women with female laborers, meaning she's working across class, so that women can use the agency they have to make their lives better and make the future better for all women. She integrated religion and social practice because she believed that if the church is being the church, it should impact the community. She says, don't wait for a deliverer because Moses is dead. We can take the promised land. Here we go. Next slide. I've just signed a contract for a book about Prathia Hall, and I hope you will read it, not because I wrote it, but because her story needs to be told. She was raised in Philadelphia as a PK. Her father was founder and pastor of Mount Sharon Baptist Church. He ran a social gospel ministry through his church. She studied at Temple. She was active in Fellowship House in Philadelphia, which was sort of a training ground for high school and college activists. And in 1962, she felt a calling to go south and join the work of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So she just hitched a ride and went to Atlanta. She became the co-leader of the Southwest Georgia Project. She was the head of the Selma Project after Bernard Lafayette in 1963. She was the head of the Atlanta Project in 1964. Because she was black, trained in predominantly white schools, but from the South, she was incredibly helpful at training white Northern college students who joined the movement how to live in the South in ways that would keep everybody safe. And when Mississippi Freedom Summer happened in 1964, she was the trainer for all of those workers. Martin Luther King Jr. called her the one speaker I prefer not to follow. After the movement, she fought her call for a long time. In fact, going to the movement was part of her fighting her call. Maybe she could get passionate about being a lawyer and forget the call to ministry. But it caught up with her. She did all of her graduate study at Princeton Theological Seminary. She joined the faculty of United Theological Seminary, then Interdenominational Training Center in Atlanta, then Boston University. If you look at who the major black clergywomen are today, I promise you I can link them back to Prathia. She is the hub of black clergywomen in America. If she was a man, everyone would know her. And my favorite thing about her story, and please still buy the book when I give you this part. In 1962, in a 1-month period, 4 black churches had been burned down because someone in the church had been supporting the movement, or they had allowed mass meetings to happen in the church. It was so bad that Martin Luther King came down to Southwest Georgia for a prayer vigil. Claude Sitton of the New York Times was there. There were TV reporters there. So King says his little spiel. They called him DeLaud. And then Prathia starts to pray. And she prays, I have a dream that over my head I see freedom. I have a dream that one day churches will stand for justice. Over and over she repeats this line. And do you know, Martin Luther King started using the phrase, I have a dream, in November of 1962. The phrase of the speech of the 20th century was authored by a 20-year-old black woman from Philadelphia named Prathia Hall. Next slide. So let's move to today. First wave fundamentalism happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s in response to science. People freaked out that science was going to disprove God. And so they came up with 5 points to try to protect God from what people could do, which really defeats their 5 points. But one was the inerrancy of the Bible, the virgin birth, substitutionary penal atonement, the resurrection, and the second coming. But second wave fundamentalism came after the movement. It came after civil rights, it came after the women's movement, because once again, people of faith, and I'm using that on purpose, people of faith got scared that other people were changing what the church was going to do, and so they added a 6th point of muscular Christianity, that men were to be the head of the home and the church and the world, that devalued women. It was a merging of Republican politics and evangelical social ideas. It was anti-feminism, including women in ministry. It was anti-intellectual and anti-evolution, anti-abortion, anti-secular, and it was pro-privatized wealth. And the way that they would sort of litmus test you for where you fell was your idea of gender roles. Do you believe the Bible is literally true about men being the spiritual head or not? And what happened was, a few white men, afraid of losing the power that they had, baptized Southern, wealthy, straight, white, male values as normative for Christians and all Americans. And they used religious language for what is patriarchal systems of racism, classism, heteronormativity, ageism. Next slide. So I want to do some translation so we can see what this looks like. So, for example, I use the group Concerned Women for America. But what that means is anti-feminism. And they'll talk about sanctity of life, but what they really mean is don't have sex and keep all the babies that you make. They'll say family values, but they don't mean love. They mean heteronormativity. They'll say education, but they don't mean public education that has openness to really know and ask and wonder. They mean private, controlled education and charter schools. They'll say religious liberty, but what they mean is legislating evangelical Christianity, which is no liberty at all. They'll say national sovereignty, but what they mean is states' rights. They only follow the federal government when the federal government does what they like. And it's in religious language, so it's crazy making to try to get to argue yourself out of this. But do you see how patriarchy challenges your ability to know yourself? Next slide. Liberation theology is God's gift to the church in the 20th century. Besides Prathia Hall, I'm convinced. In liberation theology, you read the Bible through the eyes of those on the margins. And there are liberation theologies from a variety of marginal perspectives. If you haven't read it, find me after. I can give you a book list. But in essence, all liberation theologies say hierarchy is domination, is sin. Instead of thinking about all the things you're supposed to do and not supposed to do, let's just think about sin this way. Sin brings death, and anything that brings death is sin. Holiness brings life, and anything that brings life is holy. So when we engage the text, we have to be suspicious about patriarchy because we know it's there. It's not of God, it's just in the text. And we know that patriarchy is in the institutional church. It's not of God, it's just of the church. But if salvation is liberation, then orthodoxy is working for the liberation of ourselves and others so that we can be the people of God. So just to use women as an example, women are fully in the image of God. And we are fully human, and my body reveals a piece of who God is that a male body cannot do. Blood that shed that brings new life? Sounds like a period. Women's ways of knowing things are legitimate ways of knowing. Whether it came from a textbook or your dream when you were sick, women's ways of knowing are legitimate ways of knowing. We could examine God through a variety of perspectives, the eyes of the poor, people of color, LGBTQ persons, and in every case, we are imagining God taking on that particular embodiment. What does it look like to read the text from that perspective? To see that God is bigger than we ever dared to imagine, and that love is more powerful than we dared to imagine. I tell you all this, next slide, because I want you to be thinking about the story you are writing with your life. What will our daughters and sons say of us? They're already watching. What story do we want to leave them? I don't want to leave cowardice or submission or assimilation or fear. I want to leave bold proclamation, resistance. If my gravestone said that girl was a problem, glory be to God. May you all problematize and complicate the stories. May your story never be erased, and may God be glorified in all that you do. Amen.